Welcome, everybody, and we would like to thank you for joining us again for another session of Simple Layman. As always, I'm joined with my spiritual mentor and good friend, Brother Reggie Kelly. Love that brother, and I hope the same could be said from him that he loves me. So
Working on it.
we're trudging forward here on our timeline because it has been nothing but session after session, at least in our opinion, of the kind mercy of God just giving us the trail of breadcrumbs that have finally led us to be able to make certain cases for key subjects that help us to get our apologetics in order, but also explain the beautiful things of the mystery, the expectation. We've dealt with a lot of historical issues. We've dealt with the way in which chronology has to be worked out. And now we've come to the decree that is the most central for our vantage point here, the decree of Nehemiah, to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the city. And so I want to start off by reading something out of Nehemiah that I think is actually quite interesting because it becomes a theme throughout almost the whole of the Bible, in which you see great men of God passionately dealing with a communal situation of sin, a problem of sin. And so if you open your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 1, it says, and I'm just going to read this a little bit because it's worth it. The words of Nehemiah, starting off there. So let's jump down. Verse 2, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped. So Nehemiah was notice the words there, who had escaped. Had escaped what? Had escaped being underneath the authoritarian rule and servitude of Gentiles. And so who had survived the captivity and concerning Jerusalem. So his heart is on the central city and key place in the whole of the land. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Now, that becomes all the more important to the way in which you and I understand the 70 weeks. Because as our contention has been the whole time, the reason why you must pick the out of the three returns and including the decree of Cyrus, the reason why you must start the timing here in Nehemiah is because it's dealing specifically with what the Daniel 9:24 through 27 prophecy says is going to happen in the 62-week period there, ending at the 62-week period, ending in the 7-week period, going into the 62-week period. Something has to have changed. Jerusalem has to have been built and restored. But as you see here, it's still in great distress, and the wall is also broken down. It's not been repaired. And so from the going forth of the command, that's what we've been saying, 454 BC, from that going forth of the command of Artaxerxes, Longimanus, who's on the throne with his father as co-regent, he's sending Nehemiah back now. And as Nehemiah goes there, Nehemiah is going to be the one who makes these repairs to his own city. But I want you to notice what happens first. Verse 4. And so it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven, and I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments and statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the furthest parts of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayers of your servants and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servants prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, talking about the king, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he already knows that he's going to be approaching the king to ask if he can be released from his service as the king's cupbearer. Now, the king's cupbearer was the one who would taste the wine or the food prior to the king tasting it, so that if he fell down dead because of poison, or if something was soured or didn't set well with him, Nehemiah tasted plate after plate, or drank drink after drink of anything that was brought. Nothing touched the king's lips that didn't touch his first. So he has an incredibly important job, but he's also, the proximity and closeness to the king then becomes the issue. So where else do we see a broken intercession like this for the people of God who are in captivity? Where else do we see that, Reggie? You're muted there.
Daniel 9 comes to mind.
That's exactly where I was going. What is it about Daniel 9:24 through 27 that is first couched and set in the context of a repentant Daniel who sees the need for his people to be forgiven? Now, there's two thoughts that kind of come to my mind here. Do you notice that Nehemiah very plainly asks God? He says in verse 6, Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. Now, isn't it interesting that he thought that the confession of his sin was what was necessary to be forgiven, and not the slaughtering of a sacrifice? Mm-hmm. Because he is in a faraway land, and therefore the sacrificial system was not available to him at that time. And so we know that salvation does not then require, nor does it have anything to do with, because who would doubt that Nehemiah
and he would
a
know
saved man?
He would know, Travis, even if the sacrificial system was in place and available, that David had already said that would count for nothing unless my heart is right, and unless my heart is turned. God's only going to hear the sacrifice of my heart before he can ever receive, physical sacrifices, which are a sign of a genuine heart response. Because if they're anything less than that, they're not acceptable. Go ahead.
How is your heart touched?
Yeah.
By the Spirit, right? And that's the point we're making. Is that,
of course, look to at how another common ground between the two, Nehemiah and Daniel, is this incredible love, affection, and burden, really a burden for Jerusalem, the place where God has set his name. That was such the centerpiece of the great covenant with David that had all to do with the ultimate future and destiny of the people,
Right.
of whom so many great and wonderful promises had been made, that as goes Jerusalem, so goes the people. And therefore, in terms of the coming kingdom, so goes the nations. So the issue of Jerusalem and the promise even of Jeremiah to go and restore Jerusalem, and now this concern to see Jerusalem restored. But look at verse 3 of chapter 2. And Nehemiah said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when here's the point, the city, the place of my father's sepulchre, lies waste,
Hmm.
and its gates are consumed with fire. So we're going to see that even though he goes back and in a short while begins the repair of the walls, yet to undertake a project that will realize and complete, it must be completed, the restoration of Jerusalem. This is that decree that commandment that is issued that has to do with what the 49 sevens is committed to do. What is that? To complete the restoration of the city and fulfill the promise of Jeremiah. Because until the city is fully restored, something clearly short of the promise. So the fulfillment of the promise is the first leg or the first stage of the ultimate 69 sevens on toward the fullness of the promise.
So it's important for us to be able to see on this point right here that unless you can really see that Cyrus and Darius, 538, 539, they conquered Babylon. And then the decree is made in 536 for the Jews to return. They return in that same year under Zerubbabel. And it's interesting to note that Zerubbabel was the great grandson of Jeconiah, I believe. And therefore, the lineage of David is the one who is actually leading the restoration in order to build the temple. And so, as he's building the temple and performing the work of God, he's doing so under the priestly uh, and kingly authority of those past prophecies that were made concerning the house and the lineage of his great father and King David. So the point is that it's a big deal to have the temple rebuilt. It's a big deal because the establishment of the worship of God first was what was always on these exiled believers' heart, because the sacrificial system was the penitential system for them to be able to show forth in the prescribed methodology that Moses had given them, and therefore they could keep the commandments of God through performing what the requirement of God was for them, and the feasts and all of the things that went with that. It's said that Ezra was such an incredible man of God that he built the great, perhaps he built the great synagogue, and all of that coming together right there. And he designed and prescribed things for worship. He was a chronicler. And so he was able to put together, I believe it's First and Second Chronicles, and initially Ezra and Nehemiah were all in one book together. And so that type of information that he had, as far as firsthand account knowledge, but also access to Nehemiah's personal diary and things of that nature, lays this all out for us. But the thing that is on Zerubbabel's heart is to rebuild the temple for the worship of God. The thing that is on Ezra's heart and mind is the spiritual restitution of the people, because they had fallen off into a long period of the took almost 19 years for the temple to be constructed, and there was nothing but constant problems.
Because also of the complacency of the people.
Yes, they
like,
had grown cold, and it wasn't
Haggai,
like
Zechariah,
yeah,
stirring them up.
It wasn't like there were streaming mountains of people climbing over the hills to get back to this place. It was a rubble.
But you know, on the Nehemiah decree, I think it's where you're going is Ezra, for all that he was not a builder. But listen to this in Nehemiah 2:17. Um, then said I unto them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, its gates burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall, that we be no more a reproach. The jealousy they had for the testimony of God in the earth, being bound up with Jerusalem as the witness and testimony of the presence and favor of God with that people. And the key, the absolute indispensable, without which not, of all the future promises that all the prophets built, not just around the people's spirituality, but around the restoration and true spiritual regeneration of that city. So it wasn't just
Well,
enough that the Jews repent in Babylon, but that the witness of God be resurrected in the earth and that city be restored. That's what Jeremiah. So the very language of the prophecy, to be reminded now, the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, and that's all you see throughout reiteration after reiteration of this ultimate necessity to finish not only the street and the wall, but to complete the restoration of the city that lies waste. There
so
is your first 7 sevens. There is your first 49 years.
that's exactly right. So see, that's what we're after here. What happened after Jerusalem was rebuilt? Well, what happened is you're going to go into a time when you have this 434 years, but we are not there. And so you have to step back and you have to go back and begin to look and see. This is a map that I found online. Note that we're not dealing with a full scale construction of the walls that would be built in the expansions under the Hasmonean or Maccabean period, and then the Herod the Great administrations. That little yellow line where my cursor is going around right now, that is the original city of David. And see, that is what Nehemiah and them are being sent back to. And what is it? Here you have the temple right there where I've got my cursor. That is what has been rebuilt. And then a few houses in here have been rebuilt. And I'll grant you, those there are some nice places that have been rebuilt because there's some wealthy people that came back with him. But the majority of what we're saying here is that this city was in complete ruins and utter despair as far as the majority of the city goes. So Jerusalem it's not much larger than when David and Solomon had expanded it. And this expansion that's going to happen over the next 50 years, you can only imagine if you have literally some estimates I've seen or read about, there may have been as many as 1.5 to 2 million Jews that were actually exiled out of the land. When you take the 10 tribes and then you also take all of Judah, uh, that's a lot of Jewish people to be dispersed, right? And yet, when the command goes forth for them to return, only 50,000 come back. And so we're not dealing with giant numbers of people here to go back in and resettle the land. And so this is a fairly small enterprise at the beginning. And as we see here, when you begin to put our 20th year of Xerxes and the return, we're going to build the case for Nehemiah's return to this place as the governor to help expedite these building construction endeavors so that things are actually done in a timely manner rather than just letting the people languish away. He comes there and he actually cracks the whip and gets everybody moving because he's got the king's command behind him.
His was the specific project, the specific commission to finish the restoration of that city. And not only would that be what the king is commanding, that's what the prophecy had promised.
Right. It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before, because to be sad in the king's presence was to ask your head to fall from your body, and you were going to be you were going to lose your head, and you were going to be around no more, because he just didn't you didn't treat him like that. And so it was something to be greatly afraid when the king looked at you and said, "Why is your countenance falling?" You notice Daniel has the exact same response when he's asked, "Why are you sad?" So then the king said to me, looking there at Nehemiah 2:6 up there at the top, the queen also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So how long is that going to be? Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years. So he's going to govern for 12 years. Neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provision. So he's simply making a statement here that he lived off of the wealth of his own position, and he didn't exploit the king's provisions that he could have demanded from the people, because he saw that that would have been too much of a heavy burden of taxation upon them to provide for him in an over extravagant way. And so you're talking about, from this red line, 12 years. He was their governor into this. So it's a big deal to be able to establish this, is all we're saying, because this puts us now, we're talking about 7 sets of 7 years. So here you have almost 2 of those 14 years, almost 2 of those completed. So, but during all this, I was not in Jerusalem. So he left after this, see? For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days, I obtained leave from the king. So he actually goes back, and then he's actually there with the king for a little bit. And he obviously gives a report, and they talk about what's going on. And I'm sure that taxation coming off of this city and all of that would have been in the interest of rebuilding this particular portion of the kingdom. And so he ended up coming back. So Nehemiah is the governor from 454 to 442, according to what we just read right there. So establishment of time on a line is exactly what we're looking at. When you begin to think about the state of the city, Reggie just read one of the important verses there, but I want you to think about, let's just work through these starting at the top. Now, the leaders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9/10 were to dwell in other cities. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell in Jerusalem. Now, why? There's several key things that would come off of this passage, and that is, out of the 49,800, let's just round it up to 50,000 people, you've got roughly 1 in 10. So you have 5,000 people that are going to live inside of Jerusalem. And so the other 9/10, the other 45,000, they're going to be out there, 40,000, they're going to be out there hanging out, developing the other cities from which they had originally been dwelling in. And they're trying to get the land back up and going. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. Because why? They knew they were going to be under constant opposition from those outside who would target them for all kinds of problems. And so they blessed them and said, "God be with you. We hope to see you." So the prophecy in Daniel 9 that we were looking for, the street shall be built again and the wall even in troublesome times. Listen to Nehemiah's own description. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt. That ought to be proof enough for everybody right there that this is exactly what he's being sent back to do. So this qualified our whole discussion in the last two sessions leading up to this to show that it must be the decree of Nehemiah to which the Daniel 9 prophecy is referring to. So, and the rest of Israel, of the priests and Levites who were in the cities of Judah, everyone in his inheritance. And so here you have the priests who serve in the temple and the Levites who accompany and do all of the work of the temple were all in the cities of Judah. So the priests did not even live in Jerusalem. Very few of them did. Some did, because I think you can make a case for maybe Zechariah, Haggai, some of those who were prophesying during this period, they were there. But the majority of the priests were living out, working their own lands, and they simply came. And there's even a portion when you go to read through this particular several of these texts in which they couldn't even do all that they were supposed to do because they hadn't been set aside and consecrated, so they couldn't participate in like the Passover or something. So there were just not enough people to keep up with what was going on because there was nobody there. Now, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem. So you had to go make a search to even find the people to come in to celebrate the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and singing, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps, because they were the ones who were set in that order, and they were the only ones who could lead the people in the worship of God. And so the sons of the singers gathered together from the countryside around Jerusalem, from the villages of the I don't even know how to say that, Netophalathites, from the house of Gilgal, and from the fields of Geba and Asmaveth. For the singers had built themselves villages all around Jerusalem. And so here you have this particular class of singers and all of this who were invited to come, and during the dedication they were having a great time of celebration, and they had to go out and find these guys to bring them in so that they could actually be a part of the celebration, because they weren't in the city. All's to say, the numbers were few. That's our contention about all of it. And so now let's take a look at the problems, because from the moment that Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah got there, they had nothing but problems from all of these people. And so in Ezra, the names, the main names of the people you need to learn are Sanballat. He was the governor of that region of Samaria. That's why he wields so much influence in the opposition that he brings against all of these guys, is because he's a tricky guy. And he has a lot of power, and he has troops under his control. You have Tobiah the Ammonite. You have Gresham, who is one of the main Arabs. Ammonites, who was over in Jordan. The Ashdodites, those from Philistia along the coastal plain. And then you had a prophetess named Noadia. Sorry. So the point of it is that you can see that all of these people at one point or another are going to be, I've highlighted them in red right across. You're going to be able to see that these guys are constantly using all of their power, problems, prestige, or whatever they could to produce problems for the Jews while they were rebuilding. So first of all, in Ezra 4, what do you see? But there was opposition, troubled them in building, because they hired counselors to frustrate them. So hiring counselors to frustrate them is kind of interesting. Writing letters back and forth, complaining to the kings, holding up supplies, not allowing things to get through on caravans, misdirecting information about what was what. That's what these people were supposed to do so that they could frustrate the people. And it worked. By and large, there was an apathetic spirit that did set in amongst the people because of the opposition, and the work was extremely hard. So that's when Ezra ends up coming onto the scene, and he is a spiritual renewal, a voice from God of renewal. So here you have a letter to Artaxerxes that the Jews are building the rebellious city in Ezra 4:6 through 23. And so what happens was the work was stopped. And then they sent back, and in Ecbatana, which was the capital city of the Persian Empire, where Cyrus had first taken that from I can never say that guy's name, Astages. He's the one that Cyrus, in the library there, they found the actual decree from Cyrus allowing the Jews to go back. But that took 2 years for them to do that. And so you got to remember, this is beyond snail mail. This is 900 miles of trudging across the desert to get a letter there. Time for them to actually do the research and look everything up, and then send a 4-month journey back for somebody to be able to get back to answer. You've got roughly at least 6 months of nothing but travel. So that's a long time. Then you've got Ezra 5 and 6, where you have Tattenai, the governor, who tries to stop the work, but to no avail. As a matter of fact, he was actually required by uh, the Persian king to supply. First things were slowed down, but then he was actually had to supply all that they needed by way of provisions, and so he was none too happy about that. Then you get Nehemiah 4:1 and 7, where Sanballat mocks the Jews. He's encouraging attacks on Jerusalem and paying for them himself. And who is he? He's the governor of Samaria, right next door. Then you have Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gresham making a request to have a meeting with Nehemiah. Why do they want to meet with him? Just constant back and forth. Come out and talk to us. Just come out and talk to. We just need to talk to you over here, so that they could kill him. But he was wise and discerned the times and was able to save his own life. Nehemiah 6, you have Sanballat accuses Nehemiah of planning to rebel and make himself king. And so he's writing back there saying, well, this is what you've come here for. You've come here to be the governor. What you're really wanting to do is you want to establish your own kingship over this. And so he was trying to use this as a much the same way in the death of Christ. Are you the king? Well, if you were a king, then you were in opposition to the Caesar. Well, it's no different here. If you were making yourself a king, Nehemiah, then that means that you would be taking over land that had already been conquered by the Persians, and therefore you would be at war with them. So, and then you have Sanballat and Tobiah, who hire a man by the name of Shemaiah. Got to be a song in there somewhere. But to hire a guy named Shemaiah to be a secret informer and trap Nehemiah and make him afraid, so that he would then move into the temple. And thus they would say, see, he's trying to become the king, because that's where the king is anointed. That's where that's where the high priestly garments are. And everything is kept in the temple. And so, see, they were trying to trap him and ensnare him. And Nehemiah would have none of it. Then there was constant opposition through, and this may seem like an unlikely source, but it was intermarriage with local tribes. And so, what was the command of God for the people when they came out of Egypt into the promised land? You were not to intermarry. Why? Because just like Solomon's heart was turned away because of his foreign wives, and he ends up, after spending 7 years building the house of God, the temple of the Lord, the most glorious building that was adorning anything to do in the whole of the world at that time, what happens? But he turns around, and these foreign wives, uh, through his love for them, he turns around and he builds across the Kedron Valley a place for Molech, for Chemosh, for any of the foreign gods of the foreign wives. And that was what God was saying. They'll turn your heart away. And so what happens, but that opposition is what is confronted. and it's confronted squarely. This may be the only place in the Bible that you actually see, and you can have to spend a little time reading it for yourself, because we're just doing a bit of an overview here, but you can actually go back and see that they were required. I don't care whether they had children or not, or whether they had multiple children or not, they were required to divorce those wives and to give them certificates of divorce and to leave them. And then they were to marry only Jewish women. Now that's an extremely hard thing for us to deal with, but nevertheless, that's what your own Bible says. And so Nehemiah 5 is then going to talk about constant opposition through high taxation. Now, this has to do with an in-house problem, because the wealthy Jews who had returned, they had made loans to all those people out in the countrysides and the people in the cities for them to try to be able to have crops, build their houses, be able to sustain their families while they were waiting for crops and things to come in, plus all the building projects that they would have just had trying to get their own houses and things up and going. So these guys were making loans. And what did they do? But they were charging just an exorbitant amount of interest, so much so that some of the families were having to actually sell their daughters or sons into slavery to these men, and to pay off the family debts. And so what happens was, when Nehemiah finds out about this, he is absolutely furious, and he calls them all in a meeting, and he confronts them. And I believe it, if I'm correct, he goes out and he even jerks out some of them's beard hair. I mean, he gets radically upset, and he makes them take a vow right then and right there, with a threat from uh, God's judgment upon all of their house, and the confiscation of every, because he's the governor, and the confiscation of everything they have. I mean, he comes down on these people, and they relent, they restore the interest, they forgive the loans, and they return anybody that was in slavery to them. So incredible resolution to that problem. But stop and think. You're a builder. You know, you're just a little person here. You've got a house. You've came because God burdened your heart for the glory of his great name in his city. And now here you come, and you're setting back, and all of these problems. You can't work, you can work. There's, people trying to stop you, people up holding up your goods. There's, you got to go out every day, and you're smacking on a rock with a hammer, trying to get it cleaned up so that you can restore it to be able to try to build on a wall. You're trying to figure out where you're going to get food. You're trying to figure, I mean, this is, you don't just run down to the grocery store and pick out everything you need. These people had to all be working all the time in order to provide for their own families. And so it's a big deal to come back to Jerusalem. It's a big deal to be a part of this initial 50,000, the 49,800, whatever it is, that return, because it's a big deal to be called by God to stand on the wall, so to speak. And these people are the beachhead that is established in this hostile environment, of which they have been out now for 70 years, and they have come back, and now the building process has begun, and it's just frustration after frustration. But what was it that everything was like? Because you always hear this statement right here. Well, it was 52 days and the wall was finished. Now, we're not talking about the sizable walls that King David and all that Solomon had built, and that everybody else had strengthened. And I mean, the walls that were destroyed by the Babylonians were fortifications that were a wall was built in such a way that you had the outer and the inner, and a lot of times this was filled with either dirt or rock or solid stone. All of that was built so that it could withstand blunt force trauma and absorb the enemy's attack. That's not the wall we're talking about being built right here. How do we know that? Because then I said, you see the distress we are in. What did he say? This was the word that Nehemiah heard, how Jerusalem lies in waste and its gates are burned with fire. So the point of it is that Jerusalem's a waste, the gates, everything's there. There are no gates. There's any access, anybody can get in, anybody can frustrate the work that we're doing. So what does he say? Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem. That's the point. Let us build the sanctuary that is needed to protect and house the holy place, is what's going on here. And so when you see the wall, you see right there, I've got it in Nehemiah 6:15, right here at the beginning, right where the little blue line is. It's 52 days the wall was finished. But what did the wall look like? So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height. This is not a full-fledged giant wall that you see Ahaz walking on as he's looking out, expecting, Rezin and Pekah or Remaliah to come against him. These are not giant walls like that. These are small walls, because notice how Sanballat describes them. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Amorite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, it will break down their stone wall. So this is not an elaborate fortification, but it's the beginnings. That's our argument. It's the beginnings of what the prophecy says. The street shall be built and the wall even in troublesome times. What Nehemiah was concerned about was getting the beginnings of the wall stretched around the city built, so that then the doors and gates could be hung, so that they could shut the city by night and, if need be, defend themselves during the day or the night. And so that way, as people began to make their way back, because about 17,000 or so people had returned with Ezra. And so you had now you've got 67,000 people. And then you have to stop and think, once the temple was finished, the communication that was streaming back and forth between those people and the people back in Babylon, hey, come back. Things are starting to be returned to the way they were. Come back and help us rebuild. Come back and stake your claim. Come back and work in your old father's vineyard. Come back and take over what I've built, so that, you can raise up this for future generations. All of this stuff was happening. Then you have to remember, the requirement of God was that all Jews present themselves 3 times a year before the Lord. And the temple was standing now. And so it was the requirement of God that the Jews stream back in for Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And that's exactly what you see happening. And so much so that there are a lot, I think we read the other day, just where we were talking about the way in which these sacrifices, it says, then the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the descendants of the captivity celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. So this is talking about when the temple was rebuilt. And they offered sacrifices at the dedication of the house of God, 100 bulls 100 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. So the point is that the representation of those people was there because all 12 tribes were really not nearly as lost as everybody thinks they are. And these people, just because they lived in a foreign land, doesn't mean that they didn't come back for Passover. Why don't you read the book of Acts? It says Jews from everywhere returned. And it's making the case of their common tongue and language. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, Rome, Jews and proselytes. I mean, Cretans and Arabs, everybody was streaming in to come to Passover. So the ludicrous idea that there were not represented in just a brief amount of years in this fortification of the city of Jerusalem, all 12 tribes is just really nonsense. And so God bless all of you that are trying to push that. I pray that the Lord will help you to see what we're saying, and may he give us all grace to come to a common consensus and walk with the Lord in the power of his word and not in what we believe our own personal accomplishments may end up being if we find ourselves out someday to be Jewish. So the
So you're
point of
saying
it
that
is,
all the tribes were present and accounted for. A
yes,
substantial representation, which is all you
yes,
need, which is all you need to carry forward the promise. But one thing you need to carry forward the promise is a visibility of the Jew. That's what must be critically preserved in order for God to make through them the demonstration that he hasn't invested in them, that all the prophets. Okay, but go ahead.
well, I'm just saying, I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion than it says, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Here you have offerings being made. And the point of it is, we're not saying at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah that there are large numbers of these people in the city, but I'm sure going to tell you that there's an awful lot of people that started making the pilgrimage back after the city began to be inhabited and began to be rebuilt
You know,
because
isn't
there's
isn't it
millions
interesting?
of Jews.
Yeah, Travis, just interesting that the prophecy of Micah, the famous Christmas prophecy. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you be least among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you will he come forth, who's to be ruler unto me, whose goings forth have been from of old everlasting. This of course is the pre-existent Messiah. But interesting that it says somewhere, it's in Nehemiah or one of these places, where one of the clans that came back was the clan of Bethlehem.
Hmm.
And they were about the second to third smallest of all the tribes and clans that returned. They came back and returned to Bethlehem, one of those outside cities, and yet they were among the very least. And it says, "Though you be least." And it's so interesting that a prophet in the 8th century is virtually predicting what a small representation from Bethlehem would return back from Babylon.
Right.
Ever thought about that?
That is interesting. And it had to be.
It had to be.
You have to
It,
have a representation from the tribe of Judah there.
right. And Bethlehem. And then you had, but just that little footnote, though you be least. And yet you look at the records of those that came back, so many thousand for this clan, so many hundred, and so many for that. And Bethlehem is like next to the smallest. I
Yeah.
forgot, but they were in that first 42,000 or so, but very small among all the clans or tribes of Israel, of the clans, it says. And so
Incredible.
it's amazing. Here's something being recorded in a historical book that is actually proving the miracle of some little footnote added to that great prophecy that most people overlook.
It's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Prophecy is always amazing.
That's why the beauty of prophecy being, just the way that it shows the sustainable understanding of the providence and sovereignty of God as time goes forward is almost beyond amazement. You know what? I'm just gonna leave it right here because we're already at pretty close to cutoff time here. But as I think about, everybody always uses this, Ezra and Nehemiah when they're going to do some sort of a church building project and they're trying to take their rock hammer and pry your wallet open and get $1 from you so they can build something. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that's not the message of Ezra and Nehemiah. The message of Ezra, the message of Nehemiah is that the faithful God of all of heaven keeps his covenant. That's what it is. Because he promised a land, he promised a city, he promised a dwelling place that he would choose for him to set in, because he promised a king that would come from a lowly little town called Bethlehem. That's what he promised. And that's the proof that we offer to you. Don't be dissuaded into thinking that it doesn't matter whether or not the Jews are the time clock and timetable for God's providence, because they are. And you can see every single portion of it as we've laid it out as painstakingly as it's been for many of you. Glory to us. But we worry about some becoming too tedious or tired, having no appetite for the things of God, perhaps. But know this: God is an investment in your life. The Bible is the very words of that God. And therefore, no time spent in his word, and no time spent studying about him, and no time spent conversing and talking about the great things of God is vanity. Because all else in this life, says Solomon in Ecclesiastes, is vanity and grasping for the wind. But the Bible is eternal in its nature. And that's what feeds and nourishes the dead spirits of men. So we're praying for you right now. Lord, come, be merciful, because we're not hungry enough. We're not thankful enough. We're not curious enough. We're not in love enough. We need help. We need help, Lord. We need to be changed. And we're begging you to raise up an army of God-fearing, Jesus-loving, Bible understanding men and women who will take the truth of God and will change their culture and their world with it, and shine, that they'll let their light so shine, Lord, as you commanded them, that men would see their good works and glorify their Father which is in heaven. Lord, it's to your glory that we do these things, but we can't if we're not hungry, if we're not thirsty, if God's not our all. So change us. Change our hearts, change our minds, give us a new eternal perspective, that we could delight in the things which we once thought nothing of. Help us, mighty God, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, as always, we thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate you taking time to study with us. And we pray God's richest blessing upon you and your family, and hope that you will fall in love with God's word because that is falling in love with him. Until we see you next time, God bless you guys. Bye-bye.